of purity, this idea of certainty about who we are, about who we belong to. And God forbid we have someone who claims that not only are they a part of me, but now that means that I am a part of those people? I have to learn what? I have to do what? What? Yes, you can quote me on that. What? So the interracial body, the mulatto body, is revelatory. It reveals something about the pattern of race. And here, what I want to say is that it reveals how, not what race is, but that race works. That is to say that race is doing something. It is doing work. It is actually, in fact, a mode of discipleship. We are participating in racial life. Race is not something that marks us. It is something we live into. We receive it. We confirm it. We bless it. We sanctify it. And then we also resist any ways that could be considered unfaithful. So here, one of the problems for me, for instance, growing up, on the one hand, it was the white folks. I knock on the door, little Susie. Hi, I'm here to pick up Susie. It's like the white father says, my daughter ain't dating a black man. I was like, what? Where? Who's black? So I didn't understand this identity. But then I was like, okay, well, I'm black, so I'm going to hang out with the black. Why you talk like that? What do you mean why I don't talk? You listen to Dr. Dre? No, I listen to Rolling Stones. You ain't black. So there's assertions of purity on both sides all the time. And so this is our contemporary problem. Even the problem of multiculturalism, we are fighting over retaining ourselves. The fight is over what I have to give up. I don't want to give up anything. For minority folk, we give up so much all the time. Do not tell me I have to give up something else. But is this just reiterating the problem? Are we just doing it over again? So is everything all death and gloom and stuff? No, it gets better, I promise. It gets better. Okay. So the second part of the book, the second section, part 2, talks about confession, about who Jesus is. So one of the things that we have to think about is, and why the mulatto body is so helpful to us, is that it really helps us to rethink what identity is and what personhood is. What I mean by this is that one of the really difficult things about mixed race folk in the early, when people were doing all these classifications, was not only were they trying to trace out if you were 1/16 this and 1/8 that and blah, 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 but they would also attach characteristics. So mulattoes tended to be more feminine, and they were sexually not as good, and they tended to be sterile and emotionally unbalanced. So there were, but at the same, whereas pure black men were strong and emotional and good for field work. That's a really bad definition, but go with me. Right? So, but notice how so the characteristics, it wasn't just about your classification, but it was also about an understanding of who you were deep down inside. And so once you begin to get mixed folks asserting themselves as mixed or crossing over into these various worlds, what are they beginning to suggest? But they are whole. We are whole people. We are not parts of. That you cannot look inside of me and determine the black side and the white side. When my brother and I were little, my brother has a little darker than I am, nice, was wonderful little curly hair. The girls love to run their hands through. I was always jealous. It was messed up. But part of my brother and I would literally have these conversations like, well, my brother could dance, he could sing a little bit, and we're like, you're probably like 70-30. Our dad, my dad was African American, so you got more dad in you, and we break it down by percentages. Where I was more white, we were like 6'7", and I was more white. I actually at the time I had like this straight hair, little Beatles haircut. I was very cute. I was lighter. I was also smarter. not smarter than my brother, but I was smart. I got really good grades in school. I identified myself more with my mother. Look, this is racial thinking is very subtle. My brother could dance. He was more emotional, athletic, right? Mixed folk, we are not immune to racial formation. We're right in the middle of it. But one of the things that mixed folk these days are trying to assert, and this is one of the blessings of mixed, so we want to say that we are whole people, that we no longer exist in a world where we have to say, look, you are my father, white man, I want to live in the big house. We live in a house with both parents oftentimes. We exist inside multiple communities, and what we want to say is that we are whole. You can't parse out little bits here and there. And what's really interesting is when we go back to the early Christological controversies, these are the controversies in the early church when they were trying to figure out who Jesus was. So I'm not sure how much you all know about church history, but when Jesus kind of got spit out of Mary's womb, people didn't automatically confess, oh, fully God, fully man, eternally begotten, oh, wonderful. Like they didn't know. It took them about 300-400 years to kind of work it out. And there were a whole bunch of controversies about who this person was. And what would they do? But they would parse out which part of Jesus was a miracle in God, what part of Jesus was human. So they would say, oh, that time when Jesus, when he healed that person, all God. That was all God. That was like the God part in him working. Do you remember the time when he was crying and he didn't want to do it and he was all weak and weepy? That was all human. That was the human side. And really early on, the early church began to say, whoa, we cannot divide Jesus in that way. We have to take all of him, his whole person. And so what they did was they began to suggest that Jesus is, in fact, that he is fully God, fully man. That he is God, fully God and fully man without mixture, without confusion, and without division, without separation. Now, in some ways, this would seem kind of paradoxical. Wait, how can he both be full and separate and not divided and what? And not confused? What? And this is I'm going to go technical on you, so just be patient with me. This is a little thing called, like the early church, it's a technical term in theology called the hypostatic union. The hypostatic union. And really basically what this means is that there is no part of Jesus that is without God, that is not both human and divine. If Jesus is eating his Cheerios, he's eating his Cheerios as human and divine. If Jesus is loving, he's loving as a human being and loving as God. Everything is always the same. There is no separation. These things are mingled inside of him. It is the full person. Now, this is really interesting because these is exactly the same way that early racial thinking was trying to parse out what a mixed person was and what a mixed person wasn't. And so when we begin to think a little bit about, when we come back to this creed of Chalcedon, this idea of Jesus as being fully God and fully human, what we can begin to actually see through the eyes of the mulatto, through the eyes of the interracial, is that it is actually possible for a person to have two things inside of them and not be divided. That it is possible for two things that seem so far apart to be perfectly present in one person. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that part of what we do in Jesus is that we understand is that this mixture, this curious child, is now beginning to reconcile. This child is beginning to do some sort of work. So you can't understand me apart from my mother or my father. You cannot reduce me to black or white. That to do this is to miss a fundamental aspect of who I am. So when Mary declares, how can this be? She cannot know the extent to which God bound God's self to humanity. She didn't know. But in fact, what did God do through the incarnation but became irrevocably connected to us? In the words of 20th century theologian Karl Barth, God chose not to be God without us. So this is not just about the mixture of one man, but the mixture of all of us inside of God. But what's important here is that it's not simply about